It's an absolute delight to welcome a totally stellar trio of thoughtful and independent observers of Indian politics with us tonight to decode the Indian elections. With us today is Professor Atul Kohli, the professor of politics at Princeton University, Manisha Pande, who's a managing editor of Newslaundry, and Pratap Mehta, who's also a visiting professor at Princeton University, but also the former VC of Ashoka University and the former president of the Center for Policy Research. So I know you can't entirely see the room here, but we have a room full, and a huge thank you to all three of you for joining us. We're going to spend the first half hour with the panel discussing the results, and then I will turn to all of you for your questions. So be thinking of the questions that you have in preparation. So for those of you who have not been watching the Indian elections really closely, the results that came in last week were full of surprises, and they were full of surprises in a number of ways. And I just want to lay some of those out. So the first surprise is perhaps that the BJP, the incumbent party that actually won the most seats, was surprisingly thought by many commentators to have in some ways lost. Because when it was all done and dusted, the incumbent party lost over 60 seats. It lost its single party majority and could only therefore govern by joining a coalition with the Janata Dal in Bihar and the TDP in Andhra Pradesh. A second surprise is that the opposition Unite gained almost as many seats as the BJP gained. A third surprise was that the BJP lost in the Hindi heartland, so in its core geographical base of support. And a fourth surprise was, of course, that all of the exit polls, almost all of the exit polls, got the results wrong. So I'm going to turn to each of our commentators or each of our members of our panel and ask two questions. The first is, in an election that surprised almost everybody in some way, what surprised you the most and why? And then relatedly, do you read the election results as a loss or a failure on the part of the BJP, or more of a success of the opposition? So let me turn first to Atul Kohli.
Thank you, Maya. Thanks for. There is an echo. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly, and everyone in the room can as well.
Okay.
The IT will work on the echo.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me. As to your question, of course, the biggest surprise was the overall electoral result, but that's so obvious as to hardly needs restating. But in terms of other issues, what surprised me most was the return, almost with a vengeance, of economic issues to the forefront, sort of bread and butter issues. Sort of the Hindutva dialogue had almost drowned out those, and even the return to caste politics was closer to bread and butter issues, but the harping on inequality, inflation, unemployment, and caste politics understood as not enough jobs, all of this intrigued me, pleased me, and I was glad that there was a semblance of normality of return to politics. And to your second question, whether this is, it's both, it's a loss for BJP and it's a opposition coming together in success. You can't separate out one from the other because the singular factor explaining BJP's parliamentary decline is coming together of the opposition. It's not the vote decline in the overall votes. So the two are deeply interlinked.
Thanks, Atul. Manisha, can I turn to you next?
So, a lot of interesting things about this election. One of the most interesting things for me as someone who watches the media was that, just for a little bit of context for your audience, I think the media has been Mr. Modi's biggest ally. And in that, if you turn to mainstream television news, the most loudest, the most watched medium, over the last 10 years, we've seen them, devote their time and energy to completely build the cult of Modi. In fact, we had done a little survey right before the elections, looking at primetime television news, what are the kind of discussions and debates that were occurring before elections. And we found that 50% of these debates were about bashing the opposition. So, calling the opposition unstable, questioning the opposition. There's almost a comical thing because you have a party that's been in power for 10 years, but prominent anchors weren't asking questions of the party that had been in power. They were asking questions of the opposition. And the other, almost about 30% of the debates were about how great Modi is, how he's the best leader that India could have asked for. He's brought India to the world stage, and the world is looking up to us because of Modi. And you had almost about less than 1% of debates on jobs, education, real concerns of people. So with this, it was quite interesting to see that when we hit the ground and, when we began reporting on elections, how a large chunk of Indians were completely negating this kind of mainstream television propaganda that was being fed to them 24/7 on some of the most prominent Indian news channels. The big thing that we were hearing through our election reporting was people telling us, through villages, through towns, through cities, that they want a strong opposition. That, we like what Modi may have done, even among BJP supporters. There may be appreciation for the kind of work that had been done, but there was a strong sense that we wanted a strong opposition. And I think that's most interesting about the Indian voter, that although we like strongmen, we tend to also sometimes appreciate authoritarians or authoritarianism. We like the idea of a leader who can take strong decisions and bulldoze through policy. But we don't like the idea of one man, one party. I think Indians, have this sense that this is a representative form of democracy, and we need, members of parliament who represent the diversity that India has. So I think that was very interesting for me to note. The second bit about, whether it's the opposition, do you look at this as a success of the opposition or a failure of the incumbent party? I think a little bit of both. I think the overconfidence and this clarion call for crossing 400 seats did put people a little, it made people a little suspicious, There was this sense that why do you need this absolute majority when, and what are you going to do with it? So I think that really worked against the BJP.
Mm-hmm. And last but certainly not least, let me turn to Pratap.
Thank you, Maya, and great to be part of this panel. So I agree with much of what Atul and Manisha said. So I'll just add a couple of more points of novelty to this election. So one is picking up on Atul's point about, the coming back of economic issues. And I think at one level, economic issues are always there, even in a Hindutva-dominated election. In fact, Hindutva actually capitalized on the fact that it also promised, something like a kind of rosier economic future. But I think what's striking to me about the economic issues in this election is that there are diminishing returns to welfare coalitions. So, the BJP had tried to craft out this kind of welfare coalition with Mr. Modi's pet schemes, Jal Jeevan, Swachh Bharat, cooking gas, Ujjwala. And there is a kind of expiry date to welfare coalitions. But this, by the way, also applies to opposition parties. And my colleagues at CPR remind me often that the three most astonishing welfare coalitions in the contemporary election, the three states are Andhra, Odisha, and Telangana, which have done the largest amount of cash transfers. And the incumbent parties lost very badly. So one, I think, is this interesting question whether just giving state welfare in some
whether that's actually enough for voters to reward. Or will voters come back and say, okay, tell us what's next? And I think where the BJP was tripped up in this election was it did not have a what next narrative. Prime Minister Modi said 2047 is a kind of aspirational India will be a developed country, but there was actually no real new program attached under it. Even with Hindutva, okay, the temple's done and dusted. What next? So I think that's an interesting question, that you actually cannot create permanent coalitions just with. At some point, you'll have to solve some of the deeper structural problems of the economy that I think Atul alluded to. The second novel thing, or thing that's jumped out at me, particularly in UP, is the fluidity of the social base of the political parties now. So, for example, the Dalit vote in UP seems to have split three ways. A large chunk of it has actually gone to the SP, some of it is still with the PSP, some to the BJP. And if you had said 5 years ago that actually the Dalit vote would migrate to the SP, even in an alliance, it would have been actually a lot more skeptical. So I think, except maybe for high and concentrated upper castes, some areas, the fluidity of the social base of actually all political parties, I think is actually quite remarkable. Your second question, I think the boring answer is it is a bit of both. But I actually do think, credit, I think, to the opposition. We don't talk about it enough. I must confess, I was a little bit more skeptical about their ability to transfer votes across political parties, particularly in UP, given the experience of the Congress-SP alliance last time. I think they overcome that. I think Rahul Gandhi overcoming this sort of, this tag that he had, that he's somehow not committed, at least not somebody who we should take seriously. I think that was, a huge plus. But I think it was ultimately, a spectacular own goal by the BJP. Almost, tactically, this time in terms of messaging. And I think Manisha's point about the media is interesting because it raises this question: how much do we know about how information orders work in India? My own sense is that they went so over the top on media that actually the only logical conclusion for the voter to draw was to absolutely discuss anything and everything media said. It's almost like a revolutionary revolt against that media structure, precisely because it was so. So I think that is something which will bear discussion in the future.
Great, thank you. So I think there's a little bit of a feedback. So I don't know what that is. Maybe IT can work on that. So we've heard sort of a couple of themes: the return of bread and butter issues, past politics, a pushback against a captive media, a diminishing returns to welfare coalitions, and the fluidity of the social base of parties. So I want to ask a couple more questions before I turn again over to you and your questions. So let's now look forward, right? The election is past us. Looking forward, if you had to say one thing that you think this government has delivered on, because there's a little bit also of a tension between, it's what Pratap said, it's not enough, welfare politics is not enough, and what Atul said is that there's a return of bread and butter welfare issues. So if you think about what does this coalition government have to deliver on, or if there's one thing you think voters are going to be looking at over the next 5 years, what do you think it's going to be in light of what your analysis is of these election results? And let me go backwards now and start with you, Pratap.
I think one, if we think of this election as a victory.
Pratap, can I just ask you to, if there's a little bit of we can't totally hear you.
Is that better?
It's still not great, no.
Oh, I wonder what's
okay. While you try to speak, just speak slowly and loudly. Let's listen.
Okay. So picking up on Manisha's point, right? if one of the things voters want is a robust competitive democracy, then one of the things government has to deliver is to create the institutional conditions for free and fair elections and a free and fair competitive democracy, which means thinking about how media is regulated, what media ownership structures look like, thinking about restoring independence to institutions of oversight and accountability, which has taken an incredible beating, restoring freedom to civil society so that these contestations can take place. So if the elections are about democratic contestation, then I think that is the most important thing. I think we need, in a sense, from any government to deliver. I'm very skeptical this government will deliver on those. But I think that is the one thing we want as a kind of baseline. I think the second thing, which I think Atul said, which is that, across governments now, 10 years of UPA, 10 years of, in a sense, BJP, NDA coalition, we still have not addressed the fundamental challenge of producing good jobs and making the structural transition to a high productive participative economy. I think it's a problem across governments. And I just hope that this election, sends us back to first principles on what does that architecture of a good productive economy look like.
So let me actually just pick up on a point that you said and turn to Atul. So Atul, you've written quite extensively on the political economy of India. And the point Pratap just made was that it's about employment and it's about democracy. But I want to pick up on the point about employment. You wrote in a recent op-ed that India's average GDP growth under the Modi years was just under 6%, according to the World Bank, and then just over 6% in the previous government, the UPA government. And that also inequality was an issue in this election, right? That the top 1% of Indians, you said in that op-ed, the share of wealth at the top 1% of Indians has grown from 31% to 43%. And that share has come at the direct expense of the lower 50%. So, if economics was such an important issue in this election, and if it's so important going forward, why did economics, you think, matter so much in this election and not in 2019 when some of these trends were already well apparent?
Well, Mr. Modi was still climbing in his popularity in 2019 elections. Many of us thought that rise will certainly not come to an abrupt halt. It may not rise as steeply, but there was an anticipation that Hindutva themes will continue to dominate, sort of say 4 or 5 months before the election. But as the campaign got started, I think Rahul Gandhi may well have taken the lead. I'm not sure who he was listening to, but there was a change in tone, and he started talking about economic inequality as a major theme, which has not come up before in earlier elections. And as one looks forward, I agree with Pratap. Of course, I agree with both the points he made. But in terms of deliverables from the government, they have to focus on issues of employment. Welfare, competitive populism cannot go on. It's just simply not sustainable, and yet well-being of people has to be put front and forward. Even if poverty has declined, you walk around Lucknow and other parts of UP, you don't have to be a data genius to see there's a lot of poverty out there and there aren't enough jobs, So job creation will remain the real test. And as Pratap said, and I second, that's a problem with across the parties. Right now, we don't have obvious plan and solution for how to create highly productive jobs. And for that, manufacturing has to be put front and center. You just can't create airports and hope that there will be productive jobs for the average folks who have finished high school or even a BA, not a very competent BA. But what types of jobs will these people get? That has to be the challenge in front across the parties.
Manisha, can I just ask you what you think the most important agenda item is for the Modi government to deliver on, the Modi coalition government?
So I completely agree with Pratap and Atul in the sense that when we were traveling, during the elections, the one theme that kept coming up was jobs. There wasn't a single person that I'd meet who wouldn't express some sort of anxiety around employment. Even hardcore Modi supporters, they would speak about, ideological issues, but then they'd also talk about, kids at home who have lost a year because, there's been a paper leak, or who are sitting at home and are worried about their job prospects. Now, the traditional thinking is that unemployment has always been an issue in India, and there's always been a concern. So what's so special about this election? I think that there's one fundamental change, which is that we're an aspirational country, and I think the investment an average family makes in education today is a lot, especially private education, which can be quite expensive, tuitions. So there's just a lot of money that a family of humble means puts in for their child's future. And when that doesn't translate into something, and or you have examinations and corruption in examinations, that really hurts. So even for a hardcore supporter, I think just seeing your children at home depressed because, they aren't able to crack an examination or there aren't enough opportunities, I think it really rankles. So that is a very strong theme that I felt across the length and breadth of this country. A real anxiety around the future of our children. And for young kids, of course, what are we going to do? Where are the jobs? And okay, we can't look to government to providing all the jobs, but where are the private jobs? And who's questions around skilling? So that's something that the government will really have to deliver on, because it's front and center, this concern, this anxiety around future of children. It's a young country and an aspirational country. The other thing, as a journalist, I'm very keen on seeing Mr. Modi's relationship with the media and how it evolves in his third term. This is a prime minister who's still not given a press conference in India. You've had instances of, organizations being raided after stories maybe on COVID mismanagement, or, any inconvenient story can soon be followed up with a tax notice or an ED raid. You've had journalists in jail on terror charges. So I'm very keen on seeing whether it's just going to be more of the same, or there's going to be some thinking that, okay, democracy isn't just about elections, it's also about institutions. And at least with this election, the message that voters seem to be sending is that we care about those institutions. We care about not just elections, but we care about what are the quality of our democracy. So I'm keen on seeing whether there's some rethink on a healthy relationship between the government and the media, where asking questions is not treason, where dissenting voices, are not anti-nationals. And this isn't just about the media, but the BJP, its spokespersons, and the media which supports the BJP has, over the last 10 years, labeled every dissenting voice as anti-national. We are either a paid stooge, on Pakistan payrolls, or, there's some George Soros hand or whatever, but there's just no engagement with real dissent, which I think has to change. And I'm keen on seeing, whether there's some rethink on that.
But Manisha, can I just pick up on this point of the media that you ended on? I mean, Newslaundry has been front and center of looking, actually reporting on the state of the media in India. And I know that you've done your organization has done a report earlier this year, which really looked at the major news channels and how they are functioning, I think you said, as a megaphone for the government, effectively.
Yeah.
And the Reporters Without Borders ranking of press freedoms ranked India last year at 161 of 180 countries, right? So that's below, it's below Pakistan, it's below Palestine, right? So it's really low. But so for somebody who's been thinking about this issue for a really long time now, is there a policy change? Like, is there a specific policy change that you would be pushing for? From this government? So if you, for example, had, especially some of the kingmakers in this coalition government, and they said, okay, Manisha, what can we do, right, in terms of policy? What's a single thing that you would recommend to change the structure? Is it diversification of ownership structures? What would it be?
My God, there'd be so much. But just, the one thing that was happening before the election was there was a draft bill on, the big dissenting voices have been on digital platforms. So while television news has succumbed, you had a lot of good reporting, questioning on digital media, and the medium was also often YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. And there's a digital bill that sought to sort of regulate news online, which really had us alarmed because some of the clauses were quite problematic. It could imply us having to put our stories through a government censor, the government checking whether, sort of forming a fact-checking body, which would then label news fake or real. So this was a worrisome trend for us. So right at the top, I'd want the new coalition to just jump this bill because this would really impact our work as a digital media organization. Other than that, I think this carrot and stick approach, there's a huge dependence on government advertising for most of the media. And most media in India also has business interests. So the owners would have business interests in education or mining or infrastructure. So it's very difficult for a news organization to question a government that they're in business with. So I think some regulation around ownership patterns is quite important. And this carrot and stick approach of, withdrawing ads because the story, the newspaper's done a story that you don't like. So some kind of regulation around government advertising and how that's distributed. So it shouldn't be at the discretion of, the government in power, which can just crack the whip and just withhold advertising and a large revenue chunk for an organization. So I think those two things.
Great. Just one more question for Pratap and Atul each, and then I'll take your question. So Pratap, you in a recent Ezra Klein podcast talked about the transformation of India into an increasingly a liberal state, right? And I guess I just want to ask about what you think the prospects are for that really to change. You said already this is an important, protecting democracy is an important agenda item for this coalition government. But to ask a kind of different version of the question I just asked Manisha, right? If you had the ear of, Naidu or Nitish Kumar, and what's one policy that you would want to push for, a policy change, a particular policy change that you think would help halt that slide? Or will that just happen naturally as a part of the fact of a coalition government and the fact that his partners are more secular than certainly he is?
I'm going to stick my neck out of this. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah, it's still quite hard to hear you. So maybe just try speaking up.
Okay, I'll speak. So let me stick my neck out of this a little bit. I don't think the BJP's coalition partners are actually going to lose a lot of sleep over BJP's authoritarianism. And at the margins, I don't think they will even lose sleep over BJP's Hindutva and Hindu nationalism, unless there's a kind of massive breakout of violence. I wish I had more confidence in them. I think the mechanism that's going to work is that you have a more competitive opposition, which will embolden perhaps a few of the institutions like the courts at the margins to now recognize that there might be some other game in town. And so they might as well start applying the rule of law or something like that. I think that's the mechanism by which liberty is going to be protected. But the answer to your question is that India actually needs to go back to first principles and ask what kinds of laws a modern liberal democracy needs on its books. So, for example, this government passed, a criminal code bill, right? It revised India's criminal laws. From the point of view of civil liberties, they are even more regressive than the British criminal code laws were, right? Laws regulating freedom of expression. India has to bite the bullet and say IPC 295 has got to go. Doesn't matter actually which religious community or which religious sentiments, right? It has to look at the law of defamation. So I would look systematically at all the laws that impede in the protection of individual liberty and individual dignity in India. It's not going to happen. No political party is going to sign up for it. But I think that combined with judicial reform, the speedy delivery of justice, because if you don't deliver justice, right, as we found out, right, if you can't get bail in time, if your judges are not impartial, right, you're not going to be able to protect the liberal component of a liberal democracy.
Atul, again, a same version of the same question. If you had the ear of some of the kingmakers in this coalition, and from the perspective of employment or whatever else you think is important, what is a particular policy change that you would push for?
I think creating a sense of inclusiveness for Muslims needs to be a top priority. You cannot have the countries the size of India and, with its specific history and strong contribution that Islam has made to the making of modern India, and continue to treat Muslims as somehow outsiders, infiltrators, to use Mr. Modi's phrase. And if I had Nitish or Naidu's ear, I would say, anytime this government veers once again to be strong anti-Muslim, you should threaten to withdraw support. That should be a red line. If you cannot even come to the rescue of that sort of element of India's secular history, shame on you. Because, Pratap is saying he doesn't have much confidence in these two people. Makes me sad to hear that. I suspect Pratap is right. But I would urge these leaders that it is their utmost responsibility to help create a sense of inclusiveness for India's Muslims, not only on the grounds of inclusiveness, but on the grounds of Indian nationalism. I have spoken to BJP people who have asked me, what have I got against the BJP? I say, you want to know the honest answer? I think you're not a real nationalist. If China attacks the country, you have divided the country inside. A divided country is never strong. So India has to, if there's real nationalism, you have to make all citizens of India feel part of it. And having made Muslims a target of political exclusion, I think needs to be righted.
Thank you so much for those really specific and thought-provoking comments. Let me now take your questions. And if you can't hear them, I'll repeat them. So, questions? Yes.
Thanks so much for the wonderful presentation. My questions are, first, if I'm not mistaken, the share of the BJP, the overall share of the BJP votes didn't change. So that doesn't really show, can we say that there's a decline in the popularity of the BJP or its agenda? The decline in the votes. Of course, the seats have changed, but the votes remained more or less the same.
Right.
Second question is, has there been, for example, a study that tries to gauge the difference in the style of governance between BJP-run states and opposition-run states, and the state of freedom of expression, overall press, the businesses, the opposition, or the states took advantage of the overall spirit, and they also, they were also influenced by the authoritarian drive.
Great. Yeah. So a question about comparing the BJP-ruled and opposition states in terms of repression, and then a second question on the share of the vote shares and how that has translated, and whether one can read this actually as a decline. Let me take a couple more questions so that we can get. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm curious about the low voter turnout. I haven't seen much covered on that, at least in what I've read. Do you think it might be, curious for anyone really to say, do you think it might be because people just expected a landslide victory and so they thought there was no point in or was it possibly something else that might have been explaining that?
So what drives this low voter turnout? We actually had one question that was emailed in, and that was not just pre-election, but even exit polls were evidently incorrect. What's essentially the reason for this? Is it exit polls underestimating the Congress-led alliance? Is it a fear of retaliation? What were the principal reasons for that? So let's take those three questions. Manisha, can I turn to you first? So again, the questions were, you can answer sort of which of
okay.
You feel are,
So in terms of exit polls, there are a lot of conspiracies around it, but I'd stick to what I think we can guess. One is that I think a lot of people weren't telling pollsters the truth. And this is something that we even experienced as journalists because of the low trust in media and people who come asking you questions about who you're going to vote for. I would often meet people who would say they're voting for the BJP. And then when they realize that, okay, I'm not a journalist who's going to sort of, pat them on the back for it, or who's going to, if I'd ask them questions about unemployment or price rise, they gather, okay, she's open to, hearing us out. They completely flip and change their answer and say, oh, actually, we're voting for Cycle, which is the opposition party in Uttar Pradesh. So one of the reasons seems to be that people weren't really trusting these pollsters, especially people from marginalized communities did not want to tell them who they're voting for. The second thing is, with these exit pollsters, barring CSDS, which is a post-poll analysis, which is a really trusted organization, we don't know their methodology. We simply don't know how they're going around sampling, collecting data. A lot of them are phone-ins, so they're not even face-to-face surveys. Some of it is just like calls where press 1 for BJP, press 2 for... So how authentic can such data be? The third thing is, we had a 7-phase election and the BJP seemed to have suffered massive losses in the last 2 phases, especially in the 7th phase. Now, the exit poll results were out on the very evening of the 7th phase as the counting was going on. So this hurry to give the numbers and this chase for, TRPs and being the fastest and having the bestest numbers, I think they should have just waited a day and maybe the data would have corrected a little bit and accounted for the massive losses that the BJP suffered in the last phase. So this hurry to put the numbers out because you want to be #1 channel. And that I think news channels have a lot of blame to take for that. So those 3 reasons, I think, and I think this is simply buying into this BJP, bubble of, crossing 400. On the vote share, although overall there's been like about 1% sort of a drop, but say for example in UP there's been a substantial drop. So I think what has happened with the BJP, where it's been strong, it's suffered quite a lot of losses, but then it's also picked up in places where it didn't exist, so the South or Odisha. So that's how it's kind of balanced. But for example, Uttar Pradesh, it's been a real drop in terms of vote percentage. And what was the third question? The first one?
There was a question about whether there's been a study of the BJP
opposition leaders
opposition states in terms of repression in those states.
So because most of the agencies are with the central government, the misuse of agencies is specifically a problem with the center. But, you have the situation today in India where it's so polarized and media or commentators are so divided you're with the opposition or you're with the BJP, that I think every politician would now want that kind of control on the media. So you do have instances in opposition rule states where they've filed FIRs against journalists who they perceive to be close to the BJP. You have had those situations, and or using the police to go after somebody who's pro BJP in, say, West Bengal. So you've had those cases, but just the sheer scale of it, I think, because the BJP has control over central agencies, there's more of those instances there. But I feel like I think the BJP has shown the way for politicians. So whoever's going to come next, or politicians in general, want that sort of control on narrative, and they will use whatever agencies they have at their disposal to get it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Pratap, I also am going to ask you about the low voter turnout, because that's one question I didn't mention but if anything you would like to add to Manisha's answers.
So, I have to just take the low voter turnout one first, because so yes, turnout dropped, but it's not that big a drop, and in fact, it's a reversal to the mean. I think 2019 was actually, I think, a slightly anomalous year. I mean, that's the year of the crescendo behind Mr. Modi. So I actually won't read too much into the drop in voter turnout. As for vote share, yes, it's true. The aggregate all India number looks, pretty similar. But I think Yogendra Yadav had this kind of nice point that there were two BJPs contesting. Where it was dominant, it suffered from an anti-establishment vote. I think it lost about 277 seats, 89. Its vote share has gone down. But in newer areas, like in South India, in Odisha, where it was actually the insurgent party, it has actually gained. And I think it's actually a reminder of just how kind of contingent, as it I think these political formations are. I think the point about BJP versus non-BJP states. So look, I think Manisha is absolutely right that many of the agencies that matter for individual liberty are actually controlled by the center, Enforcement Directorate, the use of tax authorities, and so on. And with the Enforcement Directorate, for example, you do have data, right, that did show that 95% of the people being targeted are actually opposition politicians. Having said that, I think on civil liberties, it is fair to say that state leaders, even of opposition parties, have not always been the most accepted. I think the model the BJP adopted actually borrows elements from the CPM in West Bengal in the 1990s. Very kind of party state-oriented regulation of civil society. It borrows from the old Shiv Sena. It actually borrows from southern parties, a mix of kind of local ethnic majoritarianism with actually incredible political control over the media. So I do think it is a fair question that most Indian political parties have not been as committed on principled basis to actually institutional integrity. None of them have batted for police reform. None of them have batted for judicial reform. So I think that criticism is actually, I think, is in a sense a fair criticism. I think we do have data that will show that over time, as the BJP consolidates power, I think the vulnerability of minorities is actually in a sense going to increase. So after 20 years of secular decline in riots, UP saw uptick in lynchings, for example, in the second term, and I think a lot of the worry about the BJP is anticipatory, which is we know that if ethno-nationalism consolidated power, eventually it ends up manifesting in violence against minorities. I mean, there's almost no exception to that.
Atul.
The questions have been well answered by both Manisha and Pratap. I'll only comment on the vote share issue, the question of that in aggregate, BJP did not seem to have lost that much support. In a sense, one needs to go back to fundamentals. Sort of the first past the post system works best when you have two competitive parties. It really gets messed up when things are really fragmented. And at this time, because the opposition came together, at least in sort of many parts of the country, you actually get something close to a proportional outcome in terms of, so you got 36% vote, you got 41% seats instead of getting 35% vote and 52% seats. So there is a little more balanced outcome because the opposition came together. Related to that, if you look at UP more closely, for example, so I spent about 2 hours going constituency by constituency in UP, wondering what would have happened had Mayawati joined the India coalition. All right, for those in the audience who don't know, Mayawati is the leader of the untouchable caste movement, the Bahujan Samaj Party. And had Mayawati joined the India coalition, in UP, there would have been 15 more seats. If you just simply count her votes. So Congress and SP, Akhlesh's party, could have given Mayawati 3 parliamentary seats and yet all come out ahead at the expense of BJP. All that to say that the vote share issue has to be disaggregated to be made sense of at a broad, large aggregate. It does not tell us that much. That's all.
Right. So we'll take another round of questions and we'll just go a few minutes over because I know we started a little bit late. So questions here. Yes, please.
Yeah, I already have like 3 questions. The first one is,
can you just keep them to just focus on 1 or 2? Yeah.
what are Palace's opinions on Amritpal Singh and like engineer Rashid winning in their constituencies? Secondly, as Ms. Manisha also mentioned that the state machinery has always been used by governments to like oppress the press, and this was including in the UPA government back in 2009. So what incentives would a government have to actually open up the press?
So there are a particular set of wins and what incentives to return to a freer media. Yes.
This is back to your future anticipations. What is the future of Hindutva?
Okay. What is the future of Hindutva? Yes, in the back there.
Respect the future. So the India bloc is it's a bunch of parties, right? How do we see them moving ahead? Because there's a lot of egos to balance there. And also with respect to the BJP, how do we see them moving ahead, especially their role in state politics? Because we did see them in the previous years toppling over governments in Maharashtra. They broke this Shiv Sena, they broke the NCP in bits. So how do we see them like in that light in the next 5 years, if they are going to stay the next 5 years?
Okay, great. And let's just take those 3. So we have a question about particular constituency wins, about the state machinery and their incentives to roll back press intimidation, the future of Hindutva, and understanding the future of the India coalition, the Unite coalition, which is balancing a set of egos. So Atul, can I come to you first?
I'll leave the media question for Manisha. She has thought about these issues longer. Future of Hindutva intrigues me, so I will comment on that. And I think there may be some difference of opinion within the panel on this, but my sense is that it has peaked. That the fact that Modi lost votes in Varanasi, that his personal seat, the margin of victory declined significantly, and the constituency of Faizabad, which houses the Ayodhya temple, that Modi and BJP were not able to win that, it sort of strikes me as, I don't know what's the right word, as deeply telling of how much echo the Hindutva ideology is happening right in the heartland. I was in Lucknow and the environments throughout this election, talking to people, taxi drivers, people in the countryside, family servants, and often probed them about different issues. And there was always a sense, we're very happy with the temple, but it doesn't feed us.
Mhm.
And so there was some sort of balancing which made me think Hindutva is peaking. If it's not echoing in UP, which is almost the heart of it all, with Ayodhya there, outside, I think in Gujarat is very strong. You have to carefully study different type of Hinduisms across different parts of India. I'm not going to get into all those complexities, but its political echo in the heartland of UP and Bihar, etc., I think is peaking.
Right. Pratap.
I will not disagree with Atul, but let me put it slightly different. Which is, I don't think it's always a question, it's ever been a question, is it Hindutva or something else? Hindutva needed a political vehicle to grow electorally, which it found in Mr. Modi and the kind of BJP he ran. For a moment, that electoral vehicle seems to have peaked. But that, to me, doesn't imply that the cultural and ideological project of Hindutva has peaked. I mean, you can read that response that we were okay with the temple, but it doesn't feed us both ways, right? You can read it as, okay, we need to move on to something else. You can also read it as, there are going to be context issues, right? Perhaps other kinds of disputes around Kashi, Mathura, some engineered violence, which can actually once again trigger, in a sense, that latent ideological current. So I would not be complacent that it has peaked. I think what has happened is, and you can see it in the kind of way the artist is, I think, now trying to I think there is a sense that the movement drew on the coattails of Mr. Modi, and in this election seems to have paid a little bit of price for his hubris. But I don't think it is actually down and out, just like Trumpism wasn't down and out in the United States. I mean, and it's Rajasthan election, I mean, one state, right? Just 6 months ago, they voted BJP against a very successful Congress government, right? And in 5 months, they turned around. I don't think this is a deep ideological shift. I mean, in terms of, so I think this is a space to be watched. Another way of putting it might be that if the BJP remains successful, right, manages to hold on to power and actually does reasonably well economically, Hindutva will surge again. Actually, that I don't think it's economics or Hindutva. It's if the BJP is credible as a governing party, it'll actually give Hindutva a great deal of boost.
And Pratap, can I just ask you to weigh in, if you wish, on this question of the India bloc and its future, or sorry, the Unite bloc and its future?
So, to be fair to the India bloc, yes, there's lots of kind of internal rivalries and egos, and that has kind of happened for years. But at least for this election, they did much better than people expected. And hopefully, I think, particularly if I think the Congress and the bigger parties, SP, UP, is the principal one you're talking about, there is no reason that actually can't hold the coalition together. In fact, the ideal, I think, outcome might be actually everybody kind of sort of getting absorbed back into the Congress fold in some kind of loose sense of the term. But I think what you will see a lot of over the next year and a half across both political groupings is you will actually see a lot of attempts by the BJP to break opposition parties, possibly break their own coalition partners. I think the dilemma will be for many of the smaller parties of the India bloc in some senses, which is, do they optimize their short-term influence I think for the bigger constituents, particularly for the SP and the Congress, which is the one that, and the Trinamool considerably going down the head, I think for them, I think an accommodation with the Congress is actually possible. So long as there is the sense that the Congress is actually going to remain a sitting and a fighting force. But I think the important thing is that they will have to continue to mobilize and not wait for the next election.
Mm-hmm. Manisha, finally over to you. Any of those questions that you want to answer, but I think particularly the question about what the incentives are of the state machinery and the government to essentially roll back some of the repressions on media.
So, interestingly, in the run-up to elections, Rahul Gandhi, in a lot of his speeches, talked about the media. And he would basically say that, look at this media that's owned by Modi or that's subservient to Modi, and they're not raising your questions, they're not raising your issues. They don't talk about what you're going through, unemployment, price rise, and they're just praising one man. All they do is show him, and all their cameras are focused at him. So I thought that was an interesting thing that he brought up, because I do feel that control over media is still a very niche issue. I don't think it's something that voters across India really care about, because there's so many other important things, day-to-day things that have real impact on you. So I don't think it's a straight up issue that people are really thinking about in terms of, elections and voting. So in that sense, there's no real incentive, because there's no real, we don't really have any way of saying that whether it really impacts somebody's voting choices or not. But there's an indirect way in which I think, we saw this play out this election. In the run-up to elections, Modi gave about 80 interviews to friendly anchors, and questions like, who's your best friend? How do you work so hard? What's the secret to your energy? No counter questions and stuff like that. All these interviews became fodder for memers. They just became, memes through elections, and it actually became campaign material for the opposition to take pot shots at Modi. So through this media that is so subservient to Modi, there were pot shots, being taken at Modi. And I think there was a sort of revulsion among people who kind of saw these two as, the media almost became a party worker. So whatever they were saying was kind of, it was going against what their harsh day-to-day realities are. And I think it was pissing off a lot of people. So that kind of created some level of kind of discomfort with the cult of Modi. So the incentive, I think, if you're a smart politician and you have your ear to the ground, I think there should be some incentive, because you realize that this is not really flying with people. This is not something that's really working for us. It's not even good PR anymore, So I think that should be a realization. And, that should come to the realization that basically there needs to be some sort of healthy conversation between the elected representative and the media that's supposed to be questioning the elected representative. You can't completely quash it and just have, soft, friendly PR events.
Great. Well, it just remains for me to thank this really just absolutely fantastic panel. All three of these speakers were on the ground in India during the elections, and they've all written extensively on various aspects of these issues that they shared with us. So please join me in thanking the wonderful panelists.